This week on Empowering Midlife Wellness, I'm talking again about the perception that estrogen causes breast cancer. I'll go over the history of how that idea came about, what the latest contemporary ideas show from modern studies regarding estrogen and breast cancer risk. This is something every woman should know, every doctor should know. Can't wait for you to listen. Hi, friends, and welcome to this week's episode. If you're just joining me, I'm Dr. Susan. I'm a board-certified gynecologist and a certified menopause practitioner. I work solely in the midlife and menopausal space. After 20 years as a primary OB-GYN, I recognized that there was such a gap in care for women like me in midlife that this is all that I do. I'm focused on perimenopause, menopause, and then everything beyond that so that we can get really good scientific information about how to improve our quality of life now and also to build the healthiest 95-year-old version of ourselves, because we have to do that now. And one of the ways to do that I'm going to talk about today is with estrogen. Now, we've talked about estrogen a lot, but just in case you haven't heard it, and even if you have, it's really important to go over this regularly because we need to know this stuff, ladies, and so do our doctors. And I can tell you most doctors don't know this stuff. No judgment. They don't have time. They don't have time to be reading articles. And furthermore, they can't even find the articles that would have this information. So I'm going to go over how all of this happened. Like, how did it get so confusing? Why do so many people still think that estrogen, the hormone we've had in our body all of our lives, is dangerous? So I'll tell you that story, and then I'll tell you some modern ways of looking at it, and then you can make your own decision. But if you're following what science now supports, you will find out that estrogen is not only safe, but it's beneficial for lots of things that help us to not only feel good, but to live longer and stay healthier. So let's just go over a little bit of the history. Many of you remember, I remember the day, it was in July of 2002. Okay, so that's almost 22 years ago. Big bunch of stuff came out in the paper, Time magazine, on every news channel suggesting that estrogen caused breast cancer. There wasn't any context. It was just printed as a statement, estrogen causes breast cancer, and then some other things like estrogen causes stroke and heart attack. So the headlines look very scary. And the funny thing was that came from a big giant study called the Women's Health Initiative. The study hadn't even been published yet. It was leaked to the media, misreported. Well, as a result of that very unfortunate incident, for 2 decades and then ongoing, people have been confused and misled because that statement was not correct. Even the authors of that study are stating it's not correct. It was taken out of context. Let me give you a little bit of background. So, Women's Health Initiative study was started in the 1990s. It was a fantastically designed, massive study funded by the government. The goal of the study was to verify that taking estrogen, now at the time, the only kind we had was what's called Premarin. We don't use that anymore, but Premarin is taken out of a horse. It's pregnant mare's urine, so quite yucky. A little bit about that. It's not the same as what we make in our own body. It's a whole combination of different estrogens that horses have, but it does work really well to control symptoms. So the reason that the government wanted to find out about this is because heart disease is a really big deal. That's the main thing that kills both men and women. And previous studies had suggested that taking estrogen reduced the risk of heart disease. It had looked very much like that was the case, but the studies were not big enough, and there was some confusion about some that said yes and some that said no. And so the NIH, which is a government institution, spent a whole bunch of money. Some people say 600 million, some people say up to $1 billion. Anyway, it was a lot on this study to try to answer that question. Now, the study was designed to answer the question about whether estrogen reduces the risk of heart disease. So when you design a study and you're looking at a particular question, you design it such that you'll be most likely to answer that question. So if you're trying to figure out if estrogen reduces the risk of heart disease, you'd want to give it to older women, and especially ones that had different risk factors for heart disease, like high blood pressure, obesity, diabetes, maybe a prior heart attack. Because if you gave it to younger women, and they only had funding to last for 8 years, so you have to think about what these people go through when they're designing a study. It's quite difficult. If you gave it to a bunch of younger women, you're not going to see much difference because they're young and their risk of heart disease is quite low. So if you give it to a bunch of older women who already have some risk factors, maybe that's going to make it most likely for you to find out whether your question is accurate or not. So you have a hypothesis and then you test it, and that's what studies do. So they recruited lots of women. Now, there were different arms of the Women's Health Initiative study, but the one that particularly looked at hormones had 20-some thousand patients, and it was a big group of patients. Now, what they did is they randomly assigned them to several groups. There was a group that was taking estrogen only, and those were women who've had a hysterectomy, because prior to the study design starting, we already knew that taking estrogen by itself can increase the risk of uterine cancer. So what they did is cleverly took all the women who'd had a hysterectomy and they were in the estrogen only arm, or they were randomized to get estrogen or something that looked like it that was actually a placebo. So the women who'd had a hysterectomy got either Premarin by itself or sugar pill that looked like Premarin. So that was one arm. And then the other arm, the women who had a uterus, got Premarin with a synthetic progestin. That means it's not progesterone, but it kind of acts like it. And at least it reduces uterine cancer. That's called Provera. The generic name is MPA, or medroxyprogesterone acetate. Anyway, we call it Provera. So that group got Premarin, horse estrogen, and Provera to prevent uterine cancer, or they got a sugar pill that looked the same. Okay, so you got the arm taking estrogen or sugar pill, and then the arm taking Premarin and Provera or sugar pill. And then off they went, and they wanted to see what would happen in regards to the risk for heart disease. They weren't particularly looking for anything else. Now, the average age woman in this study was 63. For the reasons that I mentioned, they needed women to be a bit older because they only had 8 years and they needed to see some people have heart attacks. I mean, let's get real. That's how studies are designed. Now, there were women as young as 50 and there were women as old as 79, but the average was 63. And they excluded everyone who had a lot of menopause symptoms. So this is curious. Of course, they had to do that because if I have a bunch of hot flashes and they put me in the study and I was in the sugar pill arm, I would know that I was in the sugar pill arm. On the other hand, if I had a bunch of hot flashes and I was in the estrogen arm and my hot flashes went away, I would know I was in the treatment arm. And it's really important for these very high-level studies for the subjects involved to be blinded as to what they're getting, because there's a whole bunch of placebo effect and other things that happen when you know you're getting the medication or you know you're not. Does that make sense? So that makes sense why they had to exclude women who were having symptoms of menopause. So they excluded women who were having a bunch of hot flashes and night sweats because they didn't want anyone to know what they were taking. Well, about 5 years into it, because they're consistently looking at the data, some members of the group who were organizing this study felt that there was an increased incidence of breast cancer in the group that was taking estrogen and Provera, the Premarin Provera group. Well, then they had a meeting and they decided they were going to stop the study. And that was a very, let's say, controversial decision. In retrospect, that probably shouldn't have happened. There's all kinds of intrigue about why that happened. But anyway, that happened. And then there was a press release saying that the study had been stopped because of an increased risk of breast cancer. And then that blew up all over the world. And then 80% of people stopped taking their hormones. And still to this day, people quote that study. Okay, so let's look into what really happened. Well, first of all, the study wasn't really designed to look at breast cancer. So they hadn't really weeded people out based on their risk of breast cancer in the first place. That's a little bit of a design flaw. And even if you were in the group that believed there was an increased risk of breast cancer, it was minuscule, barely even what we call statistically significant. And now, after 22 years of looking into this, there have been reviews of this thing done countless times, but a very good 20-year review looking back at what happened and looking at the patients who are still living who were in the study, looked at the control group. So remember, there was the group that took Premarin and Provera, and then there was the other group that got a sugar pill. Well, actually what happened is there was not an increased risk of breast cancer in the treatment arm. The placebo arm of that study had a very unusually low incidence of breast cancer. So it made the treatment arm look like it was higher, but it really wasn't. So all these years, we've said, keep having to take our words back. All these years, we've said that the arm of the group that took Premarin and Provera had a very tiny increased risk of breast cancer. Well, it didn't. Actually, the placebo group had a very low incidence of breast cancer. And in fact, the group that took Premarin and Provera had the same exact risk of breast cancer as the other placebo group. Make sense? So even if you believe there was an increased risk in the Premarin Provera group, it was almost insignificant. And then if you take into account that the sister group had a lower than average incidence of breast cancer, it was a null, net, neutral, no difference. Well, then, if you're still following, remember the other group, the group just taking estrogen only? They had a lower incidence of breast cancer than placebo, than any placebo group. That wasn't reported anywhere until much later. So for many years, we thought, oh, okay, the Premarin group, estrogen only, had a decreased incidence of breast cancer. So therefore, it must be the Provera that's the problem. And I talked about that for years, and this is what we thought. Well, even next level is probably not even that. Okay. So it's one of those things, I like this legal argument. I don't have a dog, and if I did have one, he didn't bite you. It's like that. Like, there's not a problem anyway, and even if there was, it's irrelevant. Okay, so what we know now from the 20-year review is that neither group had an increased risk of breast cancer. The estrogen-only group had a decreased incidence of breast cancer. Now, here's where it even gets more interesting. They followed these women now, because this was 22 years ago. They followed these women now up to 20 years past the end of the study. And the incidence of breast cancer is lower than in the placebo group. So the women who took estrogen, either kind, have a lower incidence of breast cancer than the placebo groups if they started it early. And here's the most important thing. All of the groups had a lower incidence of dying from breast cancer if they got it than the placebo group. So after 20 years, when you're looking at 30,000 women, there's going to be quite a lot of women get breast cancer because 1 in 8 women get breast cancer. But if you look at the women who were in the placebo arm and the ones that were in either of the estrogen arms, the risk of dying from breast cancer was lower if you took estrogen than if you didn't. I know this is hard to believe because we've been taught for so many years that estrogen causes breast cancer. Well, it doesn't. It just doesn't. Now, and this is Premarin. Okay, so then let's go to the next step. Premarin is not estradiol. Estradiol is the primary estrogen that we make in our bodies as human females. Premarin is a whole bunch of different estrogens that horses make. And yeah, it works well for symptom relief, but it doesn't work the same in our body as estradiol. It's very complicated, and I won't bore you with the details, but there are different receptors for estrogen, and Premarin addresses those differently than estradiol. Premarin is much more inflammatory. It causes a lot more problems than estradiol, let's just say. So even in the study that was using Premarin, which is undeniably worse for us than estradiol for many reasons. It's pro-inflammatory. As I mentioned, it's all of the not good things. It's not the same as we've had in our own body. It attaches to the receptors differently. Even in that worst case scenario, there was no increased risk of breast cancer, and there was a decrease in death from breast cancer. Now, in studies done on estradiol, that's even more so in a better way. So in the worst case scenario, there was no increased risk in breast cancer. So now that we're not using that drug anymore, we cannot extrapolate those results to every kind of estrogen. That would be like saying that every kind of antibiotic has the same side effects. Of course not. They're in the same family, but they have completely different effects on our body. So what we call bioidentical estradiol, and the fancy name for that is now isomolecular. So if you want to be really academic, you would call it isomolecular estrogen, which is estradiol. Much less inflammatory, attaches to different receptors, much less likely to cause any activity in the breast than Premarin. So in the biggest study ever done in the United States for any reason, there was no increased risk in breast cancer. So if we don't take that data seriously, what on earth study would we ever believe? I mean, this is the biggest study done. Granted, it's 22 years old and it had a whole bunch of design flaws, but even in that setting, it showed no increased risk in breast cancer, decreased risk in the estrogen-only arm, and a null risk in the other arm. There was no increase. No, none. Okay, so some criticisms people have. Well, they stopped it after 5 years, so who knows what happens after that. Well, some of the women kept taking it, and so that's been taken into account. And then other studies have been done in Europe and elsewhere, other big studies where they looked at women who took estradiol, not Premarin, for greater than 10 years and showed no increased risk in breast cancer. Now, it's hard doing a study because it's expensive. So you can maybe do it for 8 years or 10 years. It'd be really great to do it for 30 years, but who's going to pay for that? And then it would take 30 years to get the results. So, really long ongoing studies will be very cool. But if we know that taking estradiol for greater than 10 years shows no increased risk in breast cancer and actually shows a reduction in death from breast cancer, and this is true. So not only do you not have an increased risk of breast cancer compared to not taking anything, but your risk of dying if you do get breast cancer is lower if you took estrogen than if you didn't. This is just what these big studies have shown. Yeah, so granted, few of them have lasted longer than 10 years, but if we take estrogen for 10 years and find that to be true, common sense would indicate that that probably continues going, because the highest years risk that we have for breast cancer is in our 60s. And so it's covering those years in these studies. So yeah, nobody's going to do a study that lasts from age 50 to 100 because it's too expensive and it would take 50 years to find out the results. So we've got to just use the information that we have from these massive studies and then apply a little bit of common sense as well as some very fancy statistics. I'm going to repeat, there is not one well-done, massive randomized controlled trial that has shown an increased incidence of breast cancer when we take estrogen, even Premarin, but especially estradiol, versus if we don't. And I know that's hard to get your mind around, but it's true. Now, I'm going to put a link to a paper if you want to read a really good review of this below. These papers are printed in academic journals that people don't read. Frankly, they're mostly dry as a bone. And if you're in obstetrics and gynecology, you get this journal called the Green Journal. It's called Obstetrics and Gynecology. And it has a bunch of research articles in it. And this particularly great article reviews all of this, but who reads it? I mean, maybe 5% of OB-GYNs read it. And frankly, that's about it. It's not even available to the public. And so no wonder your doctors don't know this stuff because it's not being published in the news, and it should be. Like, this should be on the front page of every newspaper. It's not, because good news doesn't travel fast. And another thing is, humans don't like saying when they were wrong. Some of them don't anyway. It's very difficult for many people to come back from a very staunch position of estrogen is terrible and it causes breast cancer to say, Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was wrong about that. But yeah, we were wrong about that. And 22 years of very good research. And now this is not my opinion. This is what the very finest academic minds in the American College of OB-GYN and the North American Menopause Society and similar institutions are now stating, even the authors of the Women's Health Initiative. This is just statistically true. Okay, well, what about this question that's on your mind? Well, aren't most breast cancers estrogen receptor positive? And yes, they are. The average breast cancer has receptors for both estrogen and progesterone. Now, if you have a tiny little one of these cancers and you're taking estrogen, it will grow faster. So there's an idea that, estrogen is going to feed breast cancer. Well, it will, but only if it's there. So there is zero evidence that taking estrogen, even yucky Premarin, but let's just say we don't do that anymore. We'll just say we're taking estradiol. Zero evidence that it causes breast cancer to occur when it would not have otherwise done so. So we've just answered that question. It's been asked and answered. The answer is it does not cause breast cancer. Now, if you get breast cancer and you're taking estrogen, it will make it grow faster. That sounds scary, but there has been no study ever showing that it increases your risk of dying from breast cancer. Estrogen receptor positive breast cancers are the friendliest ones, thank goodness. Now, they will kill you if they're left alone for many, many years and have time to spread into our body. But if we're getting regular screening, cancer will be picked up early. In fact, there is an argument that I think is quite valid, that if it grows a little bit bigger, it's easier to detect earlier. No study has ever shown that it causes it to metastasize or causes you to die. And remember, I told you this is true. You're less likely to die from breast cancer if you take estrogen than if you don't. Now, we don't exactly know why that is. Maybe it's because women who take estrogen are more likely to go to the doctor more often, or who knows why, but it doesn't cause you to die. It does not. In fact, you're less likely to die from breast cancer. Because remember, both groups are going to get breast cancer anyway, because 1 in 8 of us will get breast cancer. So let that idea mull around for a little bit. Okay, so now just say you're taking estrogen, like me, and you go get your mammogram, like I did a couple weeks ago. Now mine was normal, thank goodness. Maybe you find out that you have a very tiny breast cancer on your mammogram. Well, then, yes, we're going to recommend that you stop taking estrogen during the time that you're being treated so that they can get rid of it, and then you can move on. And the idea that you can never take estrogen again is, I'll just say, controversial. Certainly, there's a very wise school of opinion that suggests once it's been completely treated and we're certain that it's gone, you might consider taking estrogen again for reasons that I'll mention in a moment. Number one is because you'll feel terrible without it, most likely. If we all are in agreement that the cancer is gone, so this is a stage 0 or 1 cancer that's been completely removed, completely treated, the only reason not to take estrogen in that scenario would be if you believe that some of it's still there. And that's a little bit of a leap, isn't it? Okay, so oncologists told you they got it all, it's all gone. And we agree that estrogen doesn't cause it to happen. So the only scenario in which that could be dangerous is if it's not really all gone, if some of it is in your system that you were not aware of. Okay, so I'll just say if I have a stage 0 or 1 breast cancer, I'll stop my estrogen until it's completely treated and I'm certain that it's all gone, and then I will get back on it. Why? Because my quality of life is terrible when I'm not taking estrogen, and we know that estrogen dramatically reduces the risk of heart disease, osteoporosis, colon cancer, as well as sexual function, and we're much more likely to die from those things. So we have to put it in perspective. So just putting it in perspective is important. So I'm going to talk another time about the cardiovascular benefits of estrogen, because those have also shown to be massive. So going back to why they designed this study, They designed it to prove what we thought, which was that estrogen reduced the risk of heart attack. Well, they stopped it because of something else. And so that question wasn't really answered appropriately in the study because it was stopped too soon. But looking back at the data on heart disease in the Women's Health Initiative study, and I'm going to make another video about that because it's independently extremely interesting. I'll just give you a little preview. Massive decrease in heart disease in women who take estrogen. And this is even with the yucky Premarin, but even much more so with estradiol. So reduction in heart disease is just absolutely 100% huge, especially if we started early. I'll talk to you about that next week. Okay, so reviewing the breast cancer stuff. I know it sounds weird. They used to think the world was flat. It just must have been hard to accept that it wasn't. But here we are. We've just got to accept this and start getting it into our minds. In the 1930s, we didn't know cigarettes caused lung cancer. These are just things we've got to put aside the information that was wrong and adopt this new information based on very solid science. And because I know it's hard to believe, I'm going to tell you again the highlights. In the biggest study ever done, looking at these things that was stopped 22 years ago, there was a fear that there was an increased risk of breast cancer. Turns out there wasn't. It was wrong. The data was not reported correctly. There was no increased risk in breast cancer in the Women's Health Initiative, and that disastrous 2 decades that have ensued where many women have been taking off their hormones shouldn't have happened. And as a result, now those poor women are now suffering from a lot of other illnesses, not to mention they felt miserable at the time. So that was really sad. And I think we owe it to them to really learn about how and why this happened. So there was no risk in that study. There have been multiple other big studies done in Europe, other places, other countries showing the same thing. So we can safely say with as much certainty as we can say about anything in the world that taking estrogen does not cause breast cancer. Does not. Now, does make it grow faster, but has never been shown ever any place to make you die from breast cancer. It grows faster in place, so it's detected early. We need to get mammograms every year. That's the end of that story. If we get breast cancer, it wasn't because of estrogen, but we want to get off the estrogen while it's being treated. That's it. And in the meantime, you can feel great and reduce your risk of a whole bunch of other diseases. If your doctor tells you that estrogen causes breast cancer, they don't know as much as you. They didn't read these journals that are stuck in obscure academic magazines that nobody can get to because you have to be a member to even see it. It's crazy. It should be on the front page. You now know more than your doctor. So take this information, tell your friends. You can take estrogen if you want to. I'm not telling you you have to. You can do whatever you want. But please don't avoid taking estrogen because you're afraid of breast cancer risk, because you don't have to be. It's never been shown in any study to be true. It was just misreported by the media. Really, really good example of how much damage the media can do when they misreport stuff. So let's be really, really careful what we believe. Okay, well, that's what I have to say again about estrogen and breast cancer. I hope you learned something. I will put a link below to this fantastic article that you would never see otherwise because it's buried in the bottom of an academic journal that nobody looks at. And then you can make your own decision. But the data is pretty clear. If you want to go all nerdy and look up every single reference in the back of it, go for it. It will all support that if you decide to take estrogen, that's a great idea for your breasts. Hope you learned something today. If you did, please share it with your friends. And I can't wait to see you next week.